Hello, Junior Archaeologist. Like a lot of people in early 2020, I find myself spending a surprising amount of time at home, which means that out of necessity, my field archaeology adventures had to be a bit closer to home, at least temporarily. Fortunately, while I was researching places that sounded like fun to visit, I found this really cool website of historic walking tours of Reno, historicreno.org, which has walking tours themed around particular neighborhoods or events related to Reno's history. And the one that caught my eye, because I live there, is Midtown Reno. I like to describe Midtown as Reno's real downtown, or downtown for people who actually live here. The whole neighborhood reminds me of the small town I grew up in, and that's probably why it's the only neighborhood I've ever lived in the whole time I've lived in Reno. It's also been undergoing a renaissance, or it was before 2020 became 2020. Whether that continues remains to be seen. But getting back to the walking tour, it consists of 30 locations, all pretty much within walking distance of my apartment. And two things that stood out to me about the tour is that some of the locations no longer exist, which means that they're not going to be on any of these videos. I was also surprised that so many buildings I never paid any attention to have surprisingly interesting histories. So I thought maybe you guys would like to come with me as I learn more about my neighborhood, keep myself from going stir crazy, and maintain proper social distance. One last thing I want to mention is that we're not going to be going through all 30 in one video. That would make for a crazy long video. This first video is 5 of the first 6 stops on the walking tour, the 6th being one of the buildings that doesn't exist anymore. So let's go take a look. First stop on our tour is the Levy House, located on Sierra and California. These days, most people know the Levy House as Sundance Books, which is the bookstore people used to think I worked at when I told them I worked at another well-known Reno bookstore. Before that, it was an office building, which used to be home to one of the field archaeology companies I worked for in town. But that was way before my time. The Levy House started out as a private residence and was built by the Levy family in 1906. Mr. Levy owned a store called Palace Dry Goods and Carpet House. The house itself is a classic revival style that was really popular in those days. If you look at every city hall built during the same time, they all have that Greek Parthenon, Greek column, Lincoln Monument style. When Mr. and Mrs. Levy passed, their 2 daughters moved the house to the west side of the original lot, leased the east side to someone who built a gas station, and subdivided the rest of the property. When Mr. and Mrs. Levy passed, their 2 daughters moved the house to the west side of the original lot, leased the east side to someone who built a gas station, and subdivided the rest of the lot. The gas station disappeared when they widened Sierra in about 1970, and the one sister living in the house passed away in 1978. That's when it originally became office space, and it was later listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1983. It's currently owned by the Nevada Museum of Art, which probably explains the bookstore. And now that I don't work in a different bookstore, I can say that Sundance Books is normally a pretty good bookstore with a really small used section. Not that I'm judging or anything. The next stop on our walking tour is the California Apartments, which are actually 2 different apartment buildings built at different times and located directly across the street from Sundance Books. And they're not especially interesting of themselves, but they do represent an interesting period in American history. For most of the 20th century, getting a divorce was a lot harder than it is today, even if you take the lawyers out of it. There were some states that didn't even allow divorces. By contrast, Nevada's divorce laws were pretty relaxed for the time, and you only had to spend 6 months to become a resident, and you could get divorced after living here for 7 months. I should point out that Vegas and the whole what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas thing wasn't a thing until the 60s. Not the saying, just the vibe. So if you wanted to stay in Nevada and get a divorce, and wanted to stay in a real town that had like paved roads and maybe something to do at night, Reno was your only real choice, which is how Reno became America's divorce capital for basically most of the 20th century. And just to make things more fun, Nevada lowered the amount of time it took to become a resident to just 6 weeks, and legalized gambling, both right around about 1931 or so. A lot of places were built just so that people could live in them for 6 weeks while they were waiting around to get a divorce. And while they were waiting, there were plenty of places to go gambling and drinking and all sorts of fun. Most of these people came from the East Coast, where the divorce laws were the strictest, which is how you ended up with a town with so many good looking houses and apartments that were both tiny and completely out of place with the Old West small town architecture you find in pretty much every other town in Nevada. Some people with a lot of money did spend their whole time living in a casino or fancy hotels, but most people ended up living in tiny, tiny apartments or super tiny homes that had almost the same amount of space. I know I'm talking about the California apartments, but I spent a month installing cable around town, and it was bizarre how tiny some of these divorce cottages were. They were less houses and apartments and more like extended stay motels, which came fully furnished, which they definitely aren't now. The apartment I live in was built during the tail end of Reno's time as America's divorce capital, and you could fit two of my living rooms into the living room of the house I grew up in, which was a completely ordinary California duplex. The first building that makes up the California apartments was built in 1921 and was designed by Nevada's most prominent architect, Frederick J. DeLongchamps. This first building has 11 apartments and is the second classic revival style building we've looked at, which meant I had to look it up. And classic revival architecture is meant to look like ancient Greek and Roman architectures, which is why the first two buildings we've looked at had porticos held up by columns and formal boxy straight lines everywhere. Frederick is also interesting because he designed a lot of buildings around town and around the state over his career. But he wasn't a formally trained architect. He actually went to school to study mine engineering, which will always be a popular major in this state. This first building was marketed to people who wanted a high class living experience complete with an electric stove and central heating, way back when that was actually unusual. And business must have been really good because the owners of the California apartments, Mr. and Mrs. Bacina, were able to build a second building behind the original in 1940. This second building was designed in the Art Moderne style, which is basically a less fancy evolution of Art Deco that led directly to mid-century modern. It had 16 apartments that were marketed as modern bachelor apartments, quote unquote, which I think are a reference to the Murphy beds that came in every apartment. They were also fully furnished and came with cedar-lined closets. And for anyone who's curious, a Murphy bed is basically just a bed frame that can be folded up and stored vertically against the wall. The Jack Bacon building started out as Green's Grocery in 1927 and is right at the end of California on Virginia. And the most interesting thing about it is that it wasn't that unique at the time it was built. Mr. and Mrs. Green had the building built and attached to the house they were already living in, and it was the culmination of a life of hard work. Mr. Green had been running grocery stores for most of his life, but always in buildings he had leased. But he was finally able to run and operate his own grocery store at the young age of 60, because what had originally been a residential neighborhood was being converted into a commercial district, one house at a time. And he figured, why not join in too? And this was basically because Virginia Street is one of the few streets that went all the way across town, at least in those days. And that wasn't all that important before big cars became commonplace. But when they did, it wasn't that surprising that people did not want to live next to a busy street full of cars and people. So Mr. and Mrs. Green got their grocery store, but being retirement age, Mr. and Mrs. Green had already both passed by 1938. Little grocery stores like Green's Grocery were already pretty common in the neighborhood. There were actually several nearby, which is probably why the building was subdivided into 3 different spaces that held a variety of businesses instead of being turned into another grocery store. Jack Bacon bought the building in 1998 and operated Jack Bacon and Company out of it. Jack Bacon specialized in publishing books, framing, and autographs. I know Jack Bacon from the days when I worked in a bookstore. The bookstore I worked at bought and sold used books, and we could hold used books for you if you requested them. One of our customers who worked at the State Museum in Carson City always requested books, a certain biography about Sarah Winnemucca. We had one kid who lived in the neighborhood who always wanted Naruto manga. And Jack Bacon bought books that he had published because when he moved his business online after he sold the building in 2015, I think that's the way, one of the ways at least, that he stocked his online store, which is actually surprisingly common. I know of at least a few other bookstores in Nevada that actually got quite a few, or quite a bit, of their stock from our bookstore. And since 2015, the Jack Bacon building has been occupied by at least two restaurants that I know of. One pretty fancy, and the current one I don't really know a lot about. The next stop on the tour is another modest retail building next door to the Jack Bacon building. The Hill building was originally built as an appliance store in 1946, with space next door for a tenant. It goes without saying that the Hill building was built by, well, Mr. Hale. And his first tenants were the people who would go on to found Maytan Music, which was a Reno institution for decades. And surprisingly, when they outgrew that space, the next tenant also became a Reno institution. The formal name of the business was Modern Radio and TV, but it's more famous because its owner, Jerry Cobb, started Nevada's first successful FM radio station in the back room. Apparently, Mr. Cobb's real interest was radio, and originally he tried to start an FM radio station in his house, which didn't get that far, but apparently no one could stop you from starting one in the back room of your own store. It was a pretty cobbled together setup with a lot of spare parts that were scavenged from all over the place. So occasionally the station antenna caught on fire, which made it a good thing that it was right next door to a fire station that unfortunately doesn't exist anymore. The station's call sign was KNEV. It still exists today as 95.5 The Vibe, a classic hip-hop station, and a pretty good one too. It should go without saying that when Mr. Cobb left the Hale building, he was no longer in the modern radio and TV selling business. At some point, the building was also a shooting location for the movie Charlie Varick, which is only interesting if you're either a fan of Walter Matthau or Don Siegel, the guy who actually directed the first Dirty Harry movie. Maybe another one. I don't actually know. I just know he directed the first one. Today, it's home to a bagel shop and Keel's, which is an Irish pub where the bartenders can actually make you a pretty good blacksmith, and it has surprisingly good free Wi-Fi. Just a little tip. The last building we're going to be looking at today was originally known as the Onsen Motor Sales Company, and it's located at the corner of Virginia and Moran Streets. It originally sold Dodges way back when they were still labeled as Dodge Brother cars. And Dodge Brother cars were most famous for being the expedition car of choice for Roy Chapman Andrews, who was often cited as being the real-life inspiration for Indiana Jones. The original Onsen Motor Sales Company showroom was opened in 1915 and located by the railroad tracks with all the other car dealerships in town. But Mr. Onsen realized that Virginia Street was becoming Reno's new main street, so he decided to move the showroom. On a side note, Virginia Street would go on to become a section of State Route 395, so basically it was Reno's main thoroughfare. All the other car dealers thought he was crazy for moving, because at that point, South Virginia Street was still a residential neighborhood. But Mr. Onsen went all in. He hired Mr. DeLongchamps, the same one who designed the California apartments, to design the building, which was built in 1923 at a cost of $40,000, which is roughly $600,000-ish in today's dollars. It also featured the brick construction, which is so ubiquitous to Reno. Mr. DeLongchamps, Nevada's most prominent architect for the first half of the 20th century, favored brick construction, which meant that most other architects and builders in town also favored brick construction. It didn't hurt that Reno had one of the biggest producers of bricks in the West, Reno Press Brick Company. Their bricks are literally all over Nevada. Almost any brick you see in any other building in any town in Nevada that was built after 1900 came from Reno Press Brick Company. But that is an entirely different story. Reno itself was also devastated by a few giant fires similar to what happened in Chicago during its Great Fire, just on a smaller scale, which probably also helped brick become Reno's building material of choice. When I say that Mr. Onsen went all in, I meant he went all in, which is difficult to imagine today, since no one thinks of Dodge as a luxury car maker of any kind. The showroom had the distinction of being the nicest dealership in town. All you have to do is look at this building compared to all of its neighbors to see how much more money Mr. Onsen spent getting it built. There are rows of decorative brick patterns, all sorts of ornaments, and he even had the Dodge Brothers logo specially made up to be put all over the building. That's what the things that look like the Star of David's are. The original Dodge six-pointed star logo was used through 1938, and unconfirmed rumors and legends say that the Dodge Brothers came up with this logo to irritate Henry Ford, who was known to be a bit anti-Semitic. It also doesn't look like it now, but there used to be a lot more glass around the building. Most of the businesses, except Golden Jackal, have painted or otherwise covered up the upper parts of the windows that go around the building. In 1927, the south half of the building was built, which is the right side of the building, and that was used as the used car section of the showroom. I believe that the Onsen family was bought out in 1944, but the building continued to be a car dealership for decades. Today, it's occupied by a variety of businesses, the only one of which I've tried is Nick's Greek Deli, which I can definitely wholeheartedly recommend. I also have to admit that Golden Jackal looks super cool. At least the stuff inside does. But I've never been in there, so I can't give a recommendation one way or the other. I have to admit that, even in this first episode, I learned more about Reno than I have in the entire time I've lived here. Which definitely means that there will be a second episode, or at least as many episodes as it takes to get through the Midtown Reno walking tour. Hopefully, by then, I'll be back on the road and exploring all the places that I never had the time to when I was busy rushing to get back and forth to various field archaeology projects. Until then, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And have a good day, Junior Archaeologist.